Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today, I get another fun day. You know, the neat thing about running these shows is that if I want to have a conversation with somebody I've never met, and I wouldn't ever have any real opportunity to meet normally, the great thing is if it's somebody that I can think of any reason to talk to, whatever, I can just call them up and I can say, can I interview you? And most people will say, okay, all right, sure. Who are you, by the way? So we get acquainted online. And this time I've heard the name Bruce Kidd for the last 40 years, 50 practically, because I've lived and been in Toronto for about 50 something years now. And I've heard his name and I know he's a good guy. And I thought, well, it'd be nice to talk to him. I don't know who he is, except that he used to be the principal of Scarborough College, which is a college at part of the University of Toronto. I taught in the other side of Toronto, out in Mississauga, at what was then called Arundel College, but now is called the University of Toronto in Mississauga. So Bruce Kidd is a sportsman. And I really took a chance this time because I called him and said, could we have a conversation? And yeah. And that means that I'm supposed to know something about sports. Well, I know less about sports than anybody you have ever met in your life. And I don't even feel ashamed of it. I don't even really, frankly, care a thing about sports. But so, what kind of a thing is that to do, to call a guy whose whole life is about sports and then say, I don't really want to talk about sports, or I don't know enough about sports to even have a sensible conversation. So that's the status of things. I took a real chance today, but so far in our warm-up conversation, he looks like somebody I can talk to. So I'm really delighted to say good morning, Bruce Kidd.
Good morning, Meta, and it's great to talk to you, and thank you very much for your intriguing invitation. I'm delighted that you ventured into this unknown area for you. I argue that sport connects to almost all the issues that you raise in such an important and intriguing way, and sport touches on most aspects of contemporary life, the economy, cities, the environment, transportation, the meanings that we give to each other and to our relationships between people. So it's not just box scores and touchdown passes and the NHL and the NBA finals that are going on right now, but it's also the economic, social, and political implications. And since you deal with peace and international communication, you've touched on a very topical, urgent issue for those of us in sport, because with the horrifying invasion of Ukraine, with the increase in authoritarian governments, with the increase in human rights abuses, and so much else, sports people like me and political leaders are actively debating issues about whether we continue to play with people from another country, how do we express our concern, what should be the ground rules. So I'm glad we're going to have this conversation.
Okay, that's good. Well, let's start with that very question, because that did interest me a little bit. When a couple of years ago, I know that Russia was found to be, it was such an interesting story. Somebody would pee in a jar and put it through a hole in the wall, and somebody would trade that for their pee. Is that right? How it went? Something like that. So they were trying to figure out who doped, and they got away with this kind of thing for a while, but got caught. And so that was, you have to say that's an interesting story. So whatever happened, they got thrown out or something and got disgraced, but did it matter to them? But tell me that story.
That is a great question, and that is being actively debated. by leaders and athletes and coaches. In 2014, Russia hosted the Winter Olympic and Paralympic Games at Sochi, with all the responsibilities of a gracious host. And it was subsequently determined that while hosting those games, it cheated to give its own athletes the advantage of performance-enhancing drugs, which for the last 30 or 40 years have been banned from international competition because of the advantage that they give athletes who dope. What it turned out, and it's a remarkable piece of detective work led by a Canadian colleague at Western University, Richard McLaren. He and his investigators found exactly what you said was going on, that the testers were bribed or were induced to change the bottles, so that after they collected the urine from the Russians who had doped, they would pass that through a little hole, and they would get a replacement sample from someone who hadn't doped or from that athlete before the doping took place, thereby circumventing the doping control. That was detected, and it was such a serious violation of the ethics of sport and the rules of sport that there were just howls from everybody. The overall governing body, the International Olympic Committee, was in a dilemma. Very briefly, although there's a long and rich history to this, the IOC tries to bring the world together through sport, and it's tried to include everyone in the world as a way of bringing them together, to provide an occasion for intercultural exchange, the development of respect between representatives of different nations, with the, some would say, idealist hope of creating a network of people in civilized society to stand as a force against xenophobia, the call to arms, the call to war, and so on. To develop that international community, they have chosen to apply a very low threshold for membership. And because of that, they now incorporate virtually every national community in the world. There are some 206 national Olympic committees. However, when people behave shamelessly, egregiously so, and what Russia did in 2014 was such an example, they struggle with what to do about it. Mm-hmm. The call from many people, particularly Canadians, was throw the bums out, expel them. They have so abused their responsibility as hosts that they should never be allowed to compete again.
Well, even if they hadn't been host, would that make any difference? Would it be any more tolerable? I mean, I can see that it's just like
it wouldn't have been tolerable, but the hosting obligation is very special.
Okay.
You don't invite the world to your doorstep and then cheat on the rules to give you an advantage. That is so in violation of the ethics.
Yeah.
That is such a dirty trick. So there were calls for the expulsion of Russia. Others in the community said, blanket bans will exclude those who didn't dope along with those who did. And should there be a group expulsion, or should only those who were clearly, convicted of doping excluded. And what the IOC did then and recently is to say, we will allow those who are dope free to compete, but we will, because the Russian state was so compromised.
Hold on. Now, it was after the games were over that they got caught, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
it was a question of, would you say that they can't, in the future, the Russians cannot attend?
That is correct.
And then they would let the ones who didn't do it. Do they know they didn't do it, or did they think they don't have any evidence that they did do it? Or what was supposed to, I mean.
Well, a bit of both, but clearly they weren't, a bit of both, but there are also Russian athletes who said, on my heart, on whatever document I use to attest, I didn't dope, and it's unfair that I should be excluded from the Olympics. So and there are other geopolitical factors involved in this, but what the IOC came up with was that they would allow athletes who could demonstrate a track record of doping-free participation to compete, but under the Olympic flag, not under the Russian flag.
Oh, I see. Okay, that's fair.
So their compromise was to ban collective Russian identifiers.
Okay, well, now, did these guys who didn't dope, did they know that the other guys were? Were they invited to dope and refused? Or if they had been aware of it, were they expected, or would the norm say that they should have informed people that other people are doping?
All of that, and the major whistleblower was a senior Russian official who fled to the United States, who still lives, to the best of my knowledge, under whistleblower protection, witness protection. And so it's complicated within Russia as well as in the international community.
Boy, now that's a bad sign. If even people informing about sports events have to fear for their lives.
That is correct. That is correct. So it's, but the pressure, I mean, one of the things that is very clear, or at least to me, is that the Putin-led Russian government has a lot invested in both the economic and the symbolic power of sport.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you deny legitimacy to that, and at the same time treat the people within Russia who do not go along fairly? And the answer, and this question has been hotly debated by all of the top people in Olympic sports, all of the sports scholars like me, and it's extremely complex. I mean, it's easy to say throw them all out. It's easy to say, because we're still interested in international communications, let it be. But if you go in some middle nuanced way, what exactly do you do?
Well,
so we could spend the rest of this podcast on that question.
Well, it wouldn't be a bad topic, as a matter of fact. But would they, this term you use, that they're not going to be competing as a representative of their country, but of the Olympics in general or something, has that ever been done before?
Yes, it has.
There have been other cases like that, right?
Well, and it's a compromise between the desire to bring everybody together and to deal with the way in which national representation, the symbolic power of collective representation, complicates, our lives in difficult ways. In 1980, after the Soviet, whether you call it invasion or support invasion of the beleaguered Afghan government, the U.S. President Jimmy Carter initiated a worldwide boycott of the Olympics that were about to be held that summer in Moscow. Mr. Carter persuaded most of the governments in the Western world, but not all, to force their athletes not to go. Okay? At the same time, there were a number of national Olympic committees in countries with a tradition of independence that said, we will go alone. We will go alone to Moscow to compete. But to show that we're not defying our own government in a way, we won't fly the British flag, we will not fly the Australian flag, we will go and march under the Olympic flag to show we are part of this international movement, but we're not here to complicate the Cold War politics by arguing that we're representing our countries. And so a significant number of delegations marched under the Olympic flag, and when they won medals, they stood on the podium under the Olympic flag, and instead of a national anthem, they asked for Beethoven's Ode to Joy to be played as a substitute. And that compromise, or that way of maintaining community while trying to avoid the kind of political complications of that period, became a very popular way of continuing this kind of representation. So in Rio in 2026, when in some sports Russia was banned for its doping violations, athletes who could prove that they were clean were allowed to compete under the Olympic flag.
What's your own position? You say that even now there's controversy about how to be fair and what should be done to discipline countries that cheat. But so if there are different points of view, do you have a strong opinion?
Well, yes, although it's increasingly nuanced and increasingly harder to argue for. I'm a believer in the ideal that sport, like music, like other forms of culture, provide an avenue of communication that, if pursued in an open, respectful way, provides an opportunity to communicate across political, ideological, religious difference, and that maintaining such conversations is a good thing for the world. And in the face of boycotts, even in the face of the call to boycott the recent Winter Olympic and Paralympic Games in Beijing, I have argued for that. I think that you don't have to. I mean, if we only, I think number one, and I've experienced this in my entire life all over the world. You can learn from people from different backgrounds. You really learn, they're not necessarily going to agree with you, but hearing their point of view enlarges your understanding of the complicated world in which we live. And if you can do that peacefully, that leads to better, better understanding, may not lead to a way forward, but it leads to understanding. And I have both experienced that in many countries in the global south, in Asia, and so on. So I believe that. And for that reason, I've argued against, for example, the call to boycott the Beijing Winter Olympics that recently held. I have, that being said, I have, and I mean, I have some qualifications for that. I worry that sports people increasingly mouth that ideal with empty rhetoric, that they do nothing intentionally to realize that kind of international exchange. They do nothing intentionally to bring people together with the conditions for exchange, for talk, and so on. And I've devoted my life to creating those conditions in international exchanges. I have made exceptions to this. During the long campaign against apartheid in South Africa, and the way that apartheid structured, poisoned, crippled South African sport, I was persuaded by Black sports leaders early in that game to join the campaign and to isolate the representatives of white South African in sport, and became the Canadian leader of the Canadian boycott against South African sport. So I made an important difference for that. One of the things that I said is that I did so because the people that we excluded were excluding others from sport. So it was not a war in another place, but it was the conditions of sport that were so outrageous that we couldn't extend the handshake of friendship anymore. In the last few months, I've made a similar exception for Russian athletes and Belarusian athletes because of this frightening invasion of Ukraine. And it seems to me that those who conduct live war in such a frightening way, violate this kind of truths and understanding too.
How does that apply when it comes to the decision they made to let individual Russian athletes compete, but under the Olympic flag and not their own? That may sort of satisfy your own ethical requirements, wouldn't it? Because it does allow good guys to get together and apparently talk about whatever else you want to talk about.
Well, the invasion happened right at the end of the Olympic Games, at the start of the Paralympics. We, as a result of the invasion and a huge international campaign of which I was part, all over the world, and I didn't play a leading role in this, but I was able to connect with people in Beijing, persuaded the International Paralympic Committee to expel Russian and Belarusian athletes from the Paralympic Village and not compete. I'm hoping this war will be over soon, but what's going to happen in the years ahead, that's an open-ended question, and the clash between these very different kind of sacred ethical values is going to be, it's going to raise some very challenging ethical questions along the lines that the world faced because of the doping violations in 2016.
The Olympics were created, as I recall, I don't know anything about it, but as kind of a peacemaking gesture or a solidarity building event between Greeks city states. Is that the case? The idea already was that if you have sports between different countries, this will help create peace. Now, you can straighten me out on what they really said.
Well, that's close, and if I could, I don't mean to interrupt you, but the ancient Olympic Games, the classical Greek Olympic Games, were involved athletes between city states, and they sought to, and the Olympic truce really sought to minimize the effect of war against these, sacred ceremonies by requiring city states to allow anybody who wanted to go to Olympia safe passage, and to require nobody to invade Olympia, the site of the games. The modern games and the ancient parallels have been both followed and shamelessly exploited. So let's just post that. The modern games, the version of modern Olympic Games, because there were several, the version of modern Olympic Games that became the most celebrated, the ones that we know today, were originated in the late 19th century by the French aristocrat Pierre de Coubertin, who, like many other people, who was part of the peace movement, and who, like many other people, saw the feverish arming of nation states as likely to lead to war. Nobody could have anticipated the catastrophe of what we experienced as World War I, but he and many others saw it coming, and he tried to use sport as a way of preventing that. The difference between Coubertin and the ancient Greeks is that Coubertin was living in a world of nation-state competition, and so he organized the games as a competition between nation states. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but yes. And so the idea would be to bring representatives of nation states together under a very low threshold, so that those representatives could talk to each other, learn to respect each other through the agonistic competition of sport and through hanging out with each other and so on, as a way of creating a kind of, a current in civil society to reduce tensions. And that is where that ideal, which I hold, was established. It was impossible to maintain during World War I. And it created such bitterness that immediately after World War I, the so-called aggressor nations, Germany, Austria, and Hungary, and maybe Turkey, I think, but I can't quite remember, were excluded from the next couple of Olympic Games. And the games were canceled, of course. The same thing happened in World War II, although after the games, they tried to bring everybody together. So clearly there are some circumstances in which games cannot occur. But for the most part, the Olympic leaders have tried to keep that experience going. Although, as we're discussing, there are huge conundrums about that.
Well, yeah, and let's question the basic premise.
Yep.
Is it really true that if you get people together from, countries that they have a strong public opinion against each other, the athletes will get along anyway, just because they respect each other's, physical fitness or something? And I'm
glad you asked that question. There's been both, empirical research, ethnography, and so on. The answer, and let me tell you my answer to that. And I've been part of teams of social scientists who've gone to, games and sites to actually explore how that works. And what I'm going to say in the next couple of minutes will be a distillation of that.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that does happen just by bringing people together, but just bringing the people together is simply not enough. The idea of just throwing people together that they're going to respect each other and so on, in my experience, it's simply not enough. It's got to be intentionally planned and programmed. It's just like in the academy, people say who preach in experiential learning. Just by moving a piece of garlic through a soup is not going to change the flavor of that soup. You've got to cut it up, you've got to boil it, it's got to be intentional. Mm-hmm. And I really believe that unless you create practices whereby not only do people compete against each other, but afterwards they have a chance to socialize with each other. Afterwards, they get a chance to ask each other and answer difficult questions. And to do that not just once, but over several time intervals, it's not going to happen. It's going to be pretty superficial. Mm-hmm. There are people who have done it well, but too much of it is simply rhetorical, and rhetoric is not enough.
Okay. We have so many cases that I hear about of soccer fans, especially British soccer fans, who go to other countries and beat up anybody they see at the stadium. I don't know what goes on, but they obviously take this sport not as an opportunity to make friends, but as an opportunity to engage in some sort of gang warfare. There's no theoretical reason that I would necessarily take for granted to assume that putting people together is going to make them get along well. It may be that if you set up a competition between people, this is exactly the reason they will go there with their, iron things that they can use as weapons because they think they're going to have a good fight. I remember, both of us have been involved with campuses of the University of Toronto on opposite sides of the city. And I remember long ago being in a discussion about whether or not the Arundel campus teams should wear the same color as the downtown campus and look like the sports, the teams should look alike, or somehow if they played each other, it should be evident that that they're basically one team.
That's right.
Or whether or not these are different teams. And there was a lot of idea of, Arundel should have its own colors and be competitive with the main campus, and probably competitive with Scarborough campus where you were, I don't know. And I was saying, no, I don't think so. I don't think that's a good idea, because if you set up a thing where the main campus and Arundel consider themselves competitors all the time, more than part of the same outfit, you're going to just create animosity instead of building friendship. Of course, I didn't know what I was talking about, but I made it up at the time because there was some, social science that I could refer to. Tell me what you think. I mean, why?
Well, on that one, I'm delighted that you said that. In an earlier part of my life, I was the dean of kinesiology and responsible for athletics on all three campuses, and mediated that issue. Oh. And mediated it in the direction of one university, three campuses. And in terms of competing against other universities, got agreement that we would have one U of T team drawn from students from all three campuses wearing the same blue and white uniform. so I was directly involved with that. We also had intramural competition where teams with different color uniforms competed against each other on all three campuses. And I was involved in creating that and really creating the financial and logistical conditions to make that supportive. So I that brings back a lot. The point I would say to the larger question is and you raised the specter of soccer hooliganism.
And hockey hooliganism, which is different because those are where the players beat each other up. And I don't
particularly
like either one.
So the question for people like me, both from a social science perspective and also as a sports leader who's been responsible for these teams, is how to create the conditions where the genuine respect for the other is what is experienced and built upon. And we can cite examples where the horrors of soccer hooliganism have been pervasive, and we can cite occasions, maybe not as celebrated, where people come back from other countries with a fresh new experience of what there are things sports people can do. I would also say that the larger social conditions and the larger political leadership is part of that. If you've got, if you've got governments in the UK fanning the flames of Brexit, you've got, even if sports people take big campaigns to combat racism, combat xenophobia, and screen thugs from games on the continent. If you've got the Brexit campaigners painting such a hostile picture of the continent, you're going to have more episodes. So these are complicated questions, and as I said, I think in my first answer to you, we can never assume that good things are going to happen. If we allow it to take for granted and do not intervene intentionally, sometimes good will happen, but sometimes the worst will happen. And it's really important for activists to work to create the conditions where humanitarian, intercultural, respectful relations occur.
Well, do you have any particular overall recommendations for reform, and in terms of what kinds of preliminary preparations should be made to ensure that when you are setting up a sporting event, that it's likely to be conducive to friendly encounters rather than the opposite? I would build this agenda back in, right across the board with a long list of increasing. I mean, in an earlier generation, in other cities, the idea of hosting the Olympics or a world championship was to welcome the world, and to be a proxy for the world. That's not the best word. To create an international venue where everyone would feel welcome and where internationalism was concerned. And there are some wonderful examples of that. My favorite example, because I was there, was Seoul in 1988. At the Summer Olympics in Seoul, where the overall slogan was
Seoul to the world and the world to Seoul. And there were conscious, well-funded, thoughtful, inspirational exchanges created by the host government and the host organizing committee. Just so heartwarming to see. And there's some that argue that the democratization that occurred in 1986 in South Korea was a consequence, maybe an unintended consequence, but was the result of that. But increasingly, because of the huge costs involved, host communities are all about us. And their focus is on the infrastructure they're going to get out of games, the medals their athletes. I mean, it doesn't do us proud as Canadians. But in 2010, we hosted the Winter Olympic and Paralympic Games in Vancouver. They were great games in many ways. There were great interventions. There were heartwarming innovations of welcoming the world, including 2 Pride houses. As we're broadcasting this in Pride Month, one of the things that Vancouver Whistler did was to host Pride houses in both Vancouver and Whistler to give athletes, coaches, and others from participating countries who felt persecuted by their governments a welcome, a chance for affirmation, and although they were never really documented or publicized, but with quiet diplomacy and with the full support of the Canadian government, the Harper government, a chance to get automatic asylum.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
Terrific story. But another part of that story was a new funding agency for athletes called Own the Podium.
What was that?
Which was, it funded athletes to win more medals than ever before.
Oh.
And to give them home advantage in trying out the games facilities. So you got Canadians saying, we're going to graciously bring the world to our doorsteps so we can beat the shit out of you. Not a fine moment for the Olympic spirit. But that approach has become the dominant one today. And I would love to see, I mean, I find myself looking backwards, a more generous, we should be welcoming the world and we should be encouraging internationalism as a result of that. And at the moment, Paris is going to have the Olympics and Paralympics in 2024. And maybe in the spirit of Coubertin, they will do a better job. But that's a hope. That's not a confident.
Well, is that dependent on the government in charge, or is it determined by the Olympic Committee of the country? In other words, I think that Paris right now has a terrific mayor and doing good things about global warming and so on, really fine work. And so I would, if I were guessing, I would assume that if she's determining how they're going to be as a host, they probably do all right. But maybe it's really some guys that I don't have any use for.
Well, and that is the question. There's got to be alliance between the national government, the municipal government, and the organizing committee and the IOC, and they've got to be aligned on what we're talking about. And at the moment, I honestly don't know. I mean, you've got this progressive mayor, and Hidalgo, but don't know the outcome for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, this relates to the other question about whether or not, politics should be determining which countries get to host the Olympics. You say there's something about Qatar going to be the next host, and there was controversy about whether it should be awarded to them because of some violations of human rights or something. Tell me about that.
Well, that's another big topic. I see that we're getting close to the end of our time, but the awarding of games is done by the IOC, which is a narrow self-appointed body, not representative of the sports world at all. The advantage is that they're isolated from national and international pressure. The downside is they're not representative because of and so they have just awarded the next series of games to Western countries. Is that a response to the anti-Asian sentiment you see in the first world? I do not know. These are, I don't want to make quick generalizations, but I will tell you that the decisions that are made about where to put major games are certainly sensitive to these currents, these winds of nation-state competition and the global. And some scholars are saying, there was such hostility. Now that Asia has had the last few games, the European powers that be are going to make sure that the next games are in first world countries. I don't know whether that's true. I don't think that's good for the project of an open, completely engaged world.
What's the story about Qatar?
Well, that's the World Cup of football, and that's awarded by FIFA, which is the International Football Soccer, and they were the ones that awarded to Qatar which promised the moon, promised that their very hot conditions would not apply, and so on and so forth. Did they bribe some delegates? Always alleged, but not, so that's where it is now. Mm-hmm. And there were people at the time who raised concerns about the human rights of workers, the treatment of workers, the treatment of women in that society, but the awarding committee took no notice of those.
Mm-hmm. You think they should have?
I would have taken that into account, mm-hmm. for sure. And I think in the 21st century, we can no longer hold our nose and place games in countries with grotesque abuses. And I think,
but that kind of violates what you said a while ago about how everybody, if you do it right, you can get.
And that's the tension, and that is the tension, mm-hmm. and it's a huge tension. So, and particularly as there's very few, if any, countries that can say we are without human rights abuses, mm-hmm. And there is some evidence that in some cases putting, as in Korea, which is the most cited example, if you put a games in a authoritarian country, it may bring the winds of liberalization. So these are very big questions, and there are no confident answers. I'm tougher now, I guess, in my old age and in the 21st century to raise human rights in the staging of games. Mm-hmm. As of 2024, the IOC is going to insist upon minimal standards of human rights in the staging of games. So in the awarding of contracts, in the employment of workers, in the broadcast, but not in the country as a whole. Mm-hmm. That hasn't been tested yet, but that's kind of the compromise between these values going ahead.
Mm-hmm. Okay, one last question has to do with the more general question of whether all sports are to be encouraged, or whether you think that some sports are too dangerous or harmful, or, well, I mentioned the notion of hockey violence. I believe I've heard that hockey players like to get into scraps, and what can be done about that. But apart from whether they themselves beat each other up on purpose or try to harm each other, some sports are intrinsically painful and injurious. I mean, boxing is bound to leave the brain scrambled. And I've heard that, ordinary football, not soccer, has some damage you can count on for the players. So I guess my question is, are there any sports that you think just should be abolished?
Yeah, I ban professional boxing and I ban mixed martial arts because of the strong likelihood of a permanent brain injury. In other sports, there are campaigns to reduce the amount of violence and concussion. And because I know that the athletes in those sports love what they do, even boxers love what they do. Mm-hmm. I'm a reformer for the most part, not an abolitionist, with those two exceptions.
Okay, so what is the prospect that you'll make any progress with that? Because I haven't heard anybody out in the street with signs saying "down with football."
Well, there are strong campaigns led by the players' unions and researchers to reduce actions, plays that lead to serious brain damage. That's certainly been the case in hockey. Nowhere near fast enough, but it's certainly a lot less violent than it was 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. And there's a huge campaign to reduce concussions. Frustratingly slow to be sure, but there are people who are pushing, and that's what I support. Because I will say that even in these seemingly violent sports, people love them. Women as well as men love playing them. And what may seem violent to us is simply body contact to others. If you look at the studies where people have done, interviews with athletes involved in film depicting, quote, violent sport, mm-hmm. they love the physical contact. They love the risk involved. As a sports person, I want to save and protect the enjoyment while reducing the clear risks of long-term injury.
Well, is it that they love it because it's risky? I mean, I think there are, as a matter of fact, I know
in part,
and the research on it, that there are people who there's a certain gene that predisposes people to like thrills and risk.
Yep.
And I know I have friends who, one guy in particular, used to go to every war he could get into. He was a Doctors Without Border, Medicine Sans Frontières, but he was in a dozen wars or so. And when he would be in between wars, he'd come and work in the emergency room of a hospital because there was, there were always some exciting people arriving, all bashed up. And when he couldn't, in between on weekends, when he had a day off from his emergency room duties, he would go rock climbing because that was pretty scary. So it may be that there are certain people who want the danger just for the sake of the danger. And if that's the case, what do? You want to encourage them? You want to make people pay to go watch them do it? I mean, for example, people who do high wire, trapeze and walking across tight ropes and things like that. I can't stand to watch them. But
well, I get that there's a quest for excitement that's a big part of many people's lives in different ways. I think in terms of sport, we have to look at the level of risk involved and where and to determine what is an acceptable and unacceptable risk. And where I have gone in my research and my public recommendations, and I was twice employed by the Ontario government to study boxing. I look at the level of the incidence of long-term damage, and where it's unacceptably high, I would say no. Where there is a risk, but and mature adults take that on with their eyes open, there's an informed consent, then I would not prohibit it. But those are, so those are, and there are no clear lines. I mean,
what about car racing? Those things where that's dangerous. What do you think about that?
Well,
in fact, I'm not sure whether you want to call that a sport. Maybe it's something else.
I don't spend a lot of time thinking about car racing. I would say that car racing, on tracks that have been, constructed in isolated places, or been constructed so that there's no risk to the spectators, there's no risk to pedestrians and cyclists and so on, and where there is there's a culture of safety, and where people are trained, and where there is a healthy amount of informed consent, I would not prohibit those. I would not, but it's not my taste in sports, that's for sure.
Okay. Well, this has been such fun. I didn't expect it to be. I thought it was going to be hard work for me to try to think up things to talk to you about, but quite the contrary. It's been absolutely interesting, even to somebody who knows nothing about sport. So, and I'm glad to know that you're the guy in charge of making some decisions about this.
I used to be.
Well, keep it up. Go back, and because we need people like you with good judgment. Appreciate it so much.
Okay, Meta, it's great talking to you, and all the very best.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Carry on. Bye.
Bye.
Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, sometimes more. This is episode number 463. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. And when you get to the website, look around. We have conversations going on there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show. This is a place for dialogue. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can buy a single copy or subscribe for $20 Canadian per year through PressReader. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see the cover of the current issue and buttons to click to subscribe.